But it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Christine Prue from a government perspective, right? She's going to give her thoughts to us on CDC's perspective on the role of social media communicating FoodRisC. Christine comes to us from CDC, from Atlanta in the United States. And her main focus is in behavioral science, and I think as we're seeing today, to solve some of these issues that we have, we just can't do some of the hardcore science, but we've got to bring in the social scientists, the psychologists, and the behavioral scientists. So please welcome Christine to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here and to meet kindred spirits in the day-to-day struggle of slogging through how to make public health relevant to people, because our goal is to protect people from things that can harm them. So I'm delighted to be here. Got the clicker. Okay. Brief outline of my presentation. Certainly start with the end in mind. Confess where we are in our own journey. Be real, talk about CDC and social media as it intersects with the food landscape, and try to bring it all together at the end. If you walk away with anything, content is still king or queen, depending on what your monarchy is. Social media is great. It's a tactic, it's a tool, but you have to have clear, credible, compelling, comprehensive, and concise information to offer people. And that whole comprehensive, concise is really a challenge because there are people who just want the bottom line, and there are people who want every gory detail. So being able to layer information with internets and social media and slice it and dice it, but present it holistically and sensically is really a challenge that we all face. CDC's main product is information. As a public health agency, we get information about what is making people sick, what are people dying from, and it's our job to figure that out and then say, what does this mean for how we live or the policies and practices in our country and around the world? How do we make that information relevant? And for us, it's a partnership between scientists and communicators to make meaning of information and then share that information in meaningful and relevant ways. And while I'd like to say it's always a handshake, most of the time it's a tug of war. It's a struggle because there's lots of different perspectives. When you look at the same piece of data, there's lots of ways to interpret it. Communication at its heart is an interpretive science, and we all are bringing our values and our ideas and our perspectives to that process. The good thing about social media is that it's a platform for inviting all those perspectives. I also think, from my perspective, as a scientist and a communication practitioner and a sort of a mutt in terms of my training, the real challenge is cultural. Science is very deliberative, it's slow, it strives for objectivity. We tend to have slow processes of disseminating information in publication. You know, something gets published 2 or 3 or 4 years after the work is completed. It's very professional. We've paid a lot for our education, so we want to use that language as much as possible to establish ourselves as experts. And getting it right is really the focus. Where in social media, it's very interactive, it's personal, it's social. And a lot of times we get caught up in the media part of it, but at its core, it's about people connecting with each other and sharing perspectives and agreeing and disagreeing some more. So it's very interactive focused, and it's really about sharing and connecting in new ways. Those cultures aren't always on the same page, and I think the challenge for us is finding where's the middle ground, where's the bridge between these two worlds in ways that can be productive for us all. So the potential is like a UN approach. How can we bring all these perspectives together and see eye to eye in productive ways? But I want to start with a couple confessions. I spend most of my time on the content side. As a behavioral science, communication science, I'm trying to make meaning of information on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of time at CDC, the epidemiologists are still in charge. It's just the way it is. We're a science-based agency. Most of them have not any social science training. So their voice and their expertise, is which we rely on, doesn't set them up for approving and reviewing and embracing what we know are good practices in either in risk communication or just general communication. So I spent the last 2 years working on a tool that brings communication science to the process of developing science, communications that convey science. And I'll be sharing this with a group of folks tomorrow. But basically, it brings communication science to an objective list of how do we score our materials and get a rank, a 0 to 100 index, because our epidemiologists are numbers people. They love numbers and data. So in speaking their language, how do we move the dial in terms of conveying science? Second of all, I am a social media laggard. I am in the over 30 crowd. So while I can talk about the value of social media as a researcher and a communicator, it's not something I experience like it's part of an important part of my life. I like to eyeball the communication. And then lastly is, like most organizations, CDC is a large organization. My lane is food safety, infectious disease communications. I'm not a social media expert, but I have those people in my organization. And what's nice to remind us all is, if you don't have the expertise, bridging to the people in your organizations to have that expertise is really important. And this presentation actually gave me a wonderful opportunity to connect with folks I hadn't connected with in a while. So thank you. So let's talk about CDC, social media, and foodborne diseases. CDC, fortunately, has a very good reputation among Americans. We are blessed with great brand recognition, and we are always at the top of the list of agencies that you can trust, which is a good place to be. But we know that trust is earned, it's not given, and we know that every day we have to act in ways that maintain our trustworthiness. It's not something you can just take for granted, and that's come up a couple times. But we also know that we have to remind people about who we are and why we exist. So if your organization isn't branding itself and isn't communicating it about itself in a way that makes itself relevant to people on an everyday basis, during a crisis, they don't know who you are. So remember that while crisis and risk communication is important in the time of crisis, most of our work is actually done long before a crisis ever occurs. And people knowing who you are and what you do and liking and wanting more of that are really important part of the conversation. So we have a whole brand strategy for our agency that we all, part of the template of this PowerPoint presentation is part of that. Social media. We know it's important for a lot of reasons, and a lot of these reasons have come up already in the conversation in terms of reaching people, engaging people, relevant. I'm going to be honest. For CDC, social media is still very much on the side of information dissemination. I would love to tell you that even though we do media monitoring and social media monitoring and use those insights to develop and refine our communication strategy, we are not in what I would call the true social media lane, which is interaction. Really interacting with people. It's not a comfortable place for scientists. They're used to being 2 steps removed from the people who are affected by their work. So we have, I think I'm hopeful as I train young scientists coming into our agency who are much more adept at social media to build a cadre of people who in the future can be the engagers and take us to the next level with that. Our strategy in social media is basically to provide content when, where, and how users want it. So social media is a part of it. We still have all the traditional media, but notice that content is at the center of this. You got to start with really good content and content that people want. This is our landscape. We have channels, lots of profiles, Facebook's, blogs, so we're there. Do I visit us there? No, but I'm not I don't know, I'm just a weird person. Experts and communities. And our goal is, the traditional is, the experts speak and you talk with all your media gatekeepers and get it out there. So the vertical approach. But we know that people want information from people they know and trust. So right now, you have to look at this integrated model, traditional and social media. As much as we'd like to say we'd like to just ignore it, it's here. It's not going away. You got to find a way to make it useful. I am encouraged by some more of the evaluation studies that are being done on social media, because right now organizations tend to be all or nothing. We're doing it or we're not doing social media. It will be nice to take it to the next level and say, when is the use of different types of social media useful or not useful? So I'm looking for the evaluation of social media to catch up with the sort of experience base that has accumulated. So I'm going to tell a couple stories from CDC perspective and lay the context. Food is enjoyable. Let's not forget that food we have to eat. We want to eat. It's part of lots of cultural traditions. It's a lot of pleasure for lots of people. But we know that it's really complicated, at least the food safety systems that sort of get the food. Most of us get our food at a grocery store. We don't grow it on our own anymore, so we're 9 or 10 steps away, and lots of things can go wrong along this way. So we know that when things do go wrong, and CDC is the place where we find out when people are getting sick from food, we have to share that information, and certainly that information in terms of not just data that informs policies, but practices as well, from consumer practices to how the media understands issues and agriculture. So lots of stuff. So we're clear in telling people, CDC, we don't provide food to anybody. We don't regulate food. That's somebody else's job. Our job is to identify when people are getting sick from the food they eat. And we're clear is about saying we are making the link between sick people and the foods that are making them sick, or the processes that went wrong. So again, clarifying your role when there's an event is really important. But there's an important context setting that needs to happen. An important part of public health's job is to define the scope of a problem. We often call it burden of illness. Has anybody heard that phrase? Okay, very, very public health jargon. But it's really important because this is sort of your denominator. When an outbreak event happens, a salmonella, E. coli, we know those are just the tips of the iceberg of a problem. They're really important tips because they're the only tips that connect people who get sick and the food that made them sick. This context is really important. So a few years ago, we go through the process of estimating how many people are getting sick from the food they're eating. Very complicated math and estimation, and we know how terrible people, at least the Americans, are at doing math. So we made a deliberative commitment to saying we need to explain how we got the math right on this. And our journalists and very motivated policymakers who are interested in food safety were involved with this. And certainly we unpacked all the gory details for highly motivated people to do them. And it was the best investment we ever made because it was credibility building for us in a way that we couldn't even imagine. I mean, when you have social media saying, CDC has done a splendid job of making the rationale for these estimates accessible on its main webpage for this topic, hey, we did our job. We did it well. But, a lot of times we think just in the crisis, that's when we're building credibility. And one of the takeaways I hope you take away is that you're building credibility every single day, long before crises emerge. So let's talk about crises. They all start with lots of uncertainty, and hopefully you get to certainty. Most people don't know that most of our outbreaks in the United States go unsolved. We never find the food. But you wouldn't know it with all the press we get on the ones that we do find. So we're really good about tooting horns, I guess. But in the meantime, when you don't know what the food is that's making people sick, it's really important to talk about what you're doing. And this is another classic risk communication principle. Talk about the process. And again, you're not talking about the process for the first time during an outbreak. You've had this information on your dark side, or you've promoted people and described the process. And many people think our processes are very straight lines, very linear processes, when in fact they're messy. They're very, very messy. If you've worked outbreaks, you know how messy they are. A couple hundred under my belt, they're very messy. So having a reference point, and this is on our website, on the steps of an foodborne outbreak investigation. It's written in plain language, so an ordinary person can understand. We can point to where we're at in the process. This has turned out really helpful with journalists who want to understand the process and are asking, well, why haven't you solved this? What's taking you guys so long? And we can talk about how many iterations here we've been through in terms of we look for this food, we couldn't find it, we're back here, we're hypothesis generation, and how many case control studies are we doing trying to get information, as opposed to being quiet and saying, you're not doing anything. Those are very different, and having a reference point of where we're at in our process has been extremely helpful to us. So 2 stories I want to tell. One about peanuts, done 5 years ago, and a recent one this summer on listeria. And the importance of communication, content syndication, and media monitoring in both of those stories. In 2008 and 2009, right after President Obama was elected for the first time, in which social media was a big part of his campaign efforts, context, I've heard that word a couple times, context matters, along with content. We had an outbreak of Salmonella typhimurium affecting a lot of people, very large outbreak, 714 people, just with the laboratory confirmed cases. That was with a peanut paste product that was made by a company in Georgia, which did terrible things, but it got its way into almost 4,000 products. And these were shelf-stable products. So these aren't things that we're going to, throw away because they go bad after a few days. The interesting thing about this peanut paste product is it wasn't the jar peanut butter that you would buy to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for your kids. So we had an interesting issue of this ingredient being in many products, but it not being the product that most moms would give to their child, unless it was in the snack foods. And early on, I was on the job with this group 4 months and bringing RisC to them in a new way. And I was at the agency long enough to know that we needed to reach a lot of people in a lot of new ways, and called my social media counterparts who, CDC had made some investments around social media and had some real innovators at the table. And literally, this was the first outbreak that we used social media. They pulled out all the stops. This is a lot of bells and whistles for one outbreak in terms of buttons and badges, health cards, blogs and webinars for bloggers, a mommy bloggers engagement, just a lot. Every bell and whistle was used, which was great because the after action reports for this campaign actually pointed to social media as being an important part of the success of this story. So I'll just show you some of the examples. Certainly you know what buttons and badges are in placement of websites. Health cards, a way to get people to convey the message to their peers. Have you checked your cupboards for these products? The reality is when you have over 4,000 products, initially FDA was just going to provide a list on their website. And I went, are you crazy? Nobody's going to have time to look at a long list if it's got that many products. Now, we didn't go into it knowing that many products would be involved. But when the list was over 20 or 30 or 40, I thought, we need a searchable database. And at that time, CDC was fortunate to have some programmers who knew how to build widgets with searchable databases. FDA didn't have that technology, so we went ahead and did that. And it was just a wonderful collaborative effort of bringing expertise to the table to meet real felt needs of consumers. January, football, Super Bowl, big deal in the United States. So we looked at the landscape of what's happening in the universe. This is emerging over Christmas holidays, and January, kids are going back to school, and then the big football game. So certainly putting out messages in the context of make sure the food you're serving is not the stuff that's been implicated in this outbreak, because the last thing you want to do is make your friends and family sick. So thinking about framing your message in the context of where people are enjoying food and who they're enjoying food with is very important. Certainly Twitter was part of the landscape. And you know you're doing something right when somebody says, how depressing that I don't get Twitter, yet the CDC does. Since when does the U.S. government get anything? So we used to taking those hits, but it was nice that somebody said we got something right. The widgets were really important. A lot of people were interested in the interactive maps. Is this in my state? Where is this food? One was so dispersed, and the foods were everywhere that it pretty much affected everybody. But this database, the FDA database widget that lists and allowed people to search for foods, look at their label, and have all that stuff, 11.4 million views, over 15,000 sites embedded that database widget into their website. So talk about the importance of partners building tools that other people want to use is really quite important. Our website is still our main channel for communicating about outbreaks. And we do have sort of a government delivery process where when there's updates made to our website, people get automatic emails, and we have a lot of subscribers to that. Content syndication is something that we're doing in the United States a heck of a lot more, and it's something you might consider. It's because CDC's content is seen as very credible. Like this is an example of the Ohio Department of Public Health. They literally keep their framework, their brand framework, and take all the content from CDC and embed it into their website. So A, they're not having to develop their own content. B, you're not dealing with inconsistency of messages. So content syndication is something that has grown a lot over the last 5 years. And we're actually getting to the place where we're doing tailored content syndication. So if we're presenting outbreak data, it's not at the outbreak, we're doing it more for chronic diseases. If there's a data set that we have that says how many people are smoking in a certain state, you can present the national data on CDC, but then have places where it does the math or pulls from the Excel spreadsheet for the local or state level data. I think this is huge opportunity. Media monitoring in the very, very important for communication surveillance. You certainly on an outbreak, you're dealing the event situation, you're doing the situation analysis, you're doing your whole incident command structure is mobilized. Well, communication is really important part of that too. In the Salmonella typhimurium example, CDC's, at the beginning, CDC's information wasn't popping up on search engines, so we had our web analytics folks say, what's the deal? And that's because all our meta tags and all our information is talking about foodborne illness. Who talks like that? They're talking food poisoning. So as soon as we changed our language, included food poisoning, and meta tagged our stuff to include what people were searching on, we rose to the top of the list. So that's really important real-time information. Social engagement, really important as well. And this is where you're looking at, conspiracy theories, information seeking, emerging issues. There's a lot of, I was interested in the presentation before, all that information and posts, what's the nature of that, the content analysis stuff. So what are people saying and how can we learn from that? Second story is about people, and this summer we produce 1 minute, yay, food listeria outbreak, huge outbreak last year. Hundreds of people affected. People died. Cantaloupes were implicated. And what we realized, a part of that, it just highlighted the notion that foodborne illnesses don't affect everyone equally. There are special groups who are much more likely to be affected by a foodborne illness. Pregnant women, elderly people dealing with immune-compromising conditions. And we decided, let's make that a focus. We've never really focused on people. Not that we ignore them, but we've never made them the focus of a data release. So this summer we focused on them. And it was interesting because the traditional media was not the least bit interested. This was data, and it was really important, foodborne data, but the focus on people just was a snoozer to them for some reason. But I'll tell you, Twitter and the social media loved the stories, because we had stories about people who are affected. And that's just a reminder, social media is social at its core. It's about people connecting with other people. So as much as we want to see it just as an information, let's start thinking about our information in terms of the relevancy and start tailoring it for the different media components. Twitter and Facebook was the main way this vital signs was shared and engaging people. So reflections, certainly providing really good content. We know that a lot of our information is shared on Facebook, but if it's breaking news, it's all about Twitter, because that's speed, speed, speed. We also know from our own media monitoring that we're not answering all the questions that people are asking on social media. We may get those insights, but as a science agency, in the middle of a crisis, carving out time to wrangle scientists and provide answers that are speedy enough is really challenging, and we need to get better at that. And then the outbreak, if it's in the news, we ought to be talking about it on social media, and that is a different voice for a lot of our scientists. And then the last thing, people are looking at different sources of information with different expectations. And I think we have to sort of scratch behind what that means for how we parse out our communication. We have a lot of opportunities ahead of us, certainly. How do we do all this in real time when there's not an abundance of staff? You guys are way ahead of us in talking risk and benefit simultaneously. We've got a lot to do to play catch up. Partnerships with communication and communicators and scientists, absolutely vital. And I'm still in the word from judicious use from the antibiotic resistance world, because I think we're still learning what appropriate and effective use of different social media technologies are for different types of information. Just acknowledge colleagues who participated in the development of this, and thank you very much.